Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining me here. If you're new, I invite you to stay with us, subscribe, and share these stories of family because they are not just tales, they are lessons we carry together. Tonight's story is called My Daughter Said, Dad, You're No Father Without Money. So I burned every debt note in the fireplace. Now, let me take you there. The house was quiet that evening. Max, 59 years old, silver hair catching the dim light, adjusted the collar of his dark jacket as he laid out a modest table. He had roasted a simple chicken, mashed potatoes, and even placed a small pumpkin pie at the center. It wasn't extravagant, but it was his way of saying, I've been waiting for you. I still believe we can sit together like before. He paused at the head of the table, smoothing a wrinkle on the linen cloth. His rough hands that once built fences, repaired engines, and signed countless checks for school fees lingered there as though they could hold time still. Every clink of silverware echoed in the silence of the dining room. The clock ticked with the steady rhythm of someone holding on to hope. He looked toward the doorway, expecting footsteps, laughter, the voice of his daughter filling the space. Then the phone rang. He smiled faintly, wiping his palms on the cloth, picking it up with a hopeful hello on the other end. Her voice came sharp, almost impatient. Dad, listen. I can't make it tonight. I'm too busy. He tried to steady his voice. Busy, honey. It's just a simple dinner. I wanted us to. She cut him off, words colder than the November air outside. Dad, you're no father without money. Don't expect me unless you can help me out. The words landed like a hammer. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The dining room, the food, the careful setting, all of it blurred. He held the phone as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, the voice of his own child slicing through years of sacrifice. Max didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat tightened, his chest ached. He stood there in his dark jacket, surrounded by silence, feeling something inside him fracture quietly but irreparably. The clock ticked on. The chicken cooled. The pie sat untouched. And Max in that moment realized this was not just a missed dinner. It was a wound-cut, deep one that would change everything that came after. The phone call ended, but her words still echoed in Max's ears, sharper than any blade. He placed the receiver back on its cradle with deliberate care, as though even that small motion carried the weight of years. The dining room was still yet inside his chest. Memories stirred, memories he had not invited, but ones that came rushing back in cruel contrast to what he had just heard. He remembered the winter nights when his daughter was small, coughing in her sleep, and he would pace the floor with her in his arms, whispering lullabies until the fever broke. He remembered walking to the factory at dawn, the frost biting through his coat, because overtime meant she could have new shoes for school. The scent of grease and metal from the plant seemed to drift back into the room with him, mingling with the fading aroma of roasted chicken. His hands, once young and strong, had carried heavy beams, lifted crates, and bent steel, yet all he ever thought of was how that labor turned into textbooks, into ballet lessons, into dreams he wanted her to chase. Dad, you're no father without money. The words clashed against those memories like stones against glass. He could see her face at age 8, eyes shining, when he handed her the bike he bought second-hand and painted red just to make it feel new. He had worked 3 weekends straight for that bike. She never knew. She only smiled and said, Daddy, you're the best. Max pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down heavily. His rough palms pressed together, trembling slightly. The silverware rattled faintly on the plates as if the table itself shared his unease. Outside, the wind pushed against the old windows, whistling a hollow song. He thought of the mortgage payments he covered when her first apartment fell behind the hospital bill. He quietly settled when she had surgery, the rent envelopes slipped under her door without a name written. It was never about thanks. It was about love. That's what he told himself. A father does not keep score. And yet tonight, hearing his own child strip his worth down to dollar bills, Max felt something stir, a quiet shift like a fault line deep in the earth. He sat at the table, staring at the empty plate meant for her, the flicker of the candle reflecting in his weary eyes. For the first time in years, the thought pressed on him with an unfamiliar weight, maybe all I had given was never seen as love at all. Maybe it was just money. The clock ticked again, slow and relentless, carrying him toward a truth he could no longer ignore. The candlelight trembled, as if it too felt the sting of her words. Max sat still at the head of the table, his shoulders squared yet heavy, his breath uneven. He stared at the empty plate set before him, then at the untouched food cooling slowly, its aroma turning faint and sour in the silence. Her voice would not leave his ears. "Dad, you're no father without money." It looped inside him, breaking against the walls of his chest, louder with each return. He closed his eyes and saw her again, as a teenager rushing out the door in the rain. He had followed after her with an umbrella, but she had shaken his hand away. He thought it was just youth, just pride. But now the echo from the phone made that memory taste bitter. He rose from his chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and walked slowly to the mantel where an old photo stood, his wife smiling, holding their daughter as a baby. Max picked up the frame. The glass felt cold, like the chill of a grave. He traced the outline of his wife's face with his finger and whispered, "Did we fail her somehow?" The clock ticked behind him, a metronome to his unraveling patience. His mind began lining up the years like witnesses in a courtroom. The bills paid, the nights without sleep, the truck that hauled furniture for her first home, the loans signed when she promised to repay but never did. Each sacrifice stood there, and opposite them her accusation. "You're no father without money." Max pressed his fist to his mouth, muffling a sound that was half a sob, half a growl. His other hand clenched so hard the veins rose like cords. The photo frame trembled, his reflection warped in the glass. The air in the room thickened. It was not just grief anymore. Something else stirred, a quiet rage, sharp but controlled, the kind that grows in men who have swallowed too many insults in silence. He set the photo back on the mantel, straighter than before, as though anchoring himself. His eyes lifted, and the candlelight caught the steel in them. "I gave her my years," he muttered under his breath. "And she calls me nothing." The words hung in the room, heavy, final. For the first time, Max no longer felt the sting of her dismissal as just pain. It began to feel like a challenge, one he would not leave unanswered. The plate still sat waiting at the table, but now it looked less like a place for family and more like evidence of absence. Max knew something had shifted tonight, something that could not be undone. The night deepened, pressing against the windows like a weight. Max moved back to the table, his steps slow, deliberate. The food sat there untouched, steam long gone, the turkey skin dull and stiffening. He lowered himself into the chair again, the wood creaking as though it carried the same exhaustion he did. He thought of the years he had worked double shifts at the factory, his hands cracked and blackened from grease, just to make sure she could have a prom dress that shimmered under the lights. He remembered the truckloads of lumber he had hauled when she wanted her first house's porch rebuilt. He never once complained. Sacrifice was simply what fathers did. Yet now those memories came back, not as warmth, but as accusation. Why does she not see the candle guttered, throwing his shadow long across the wall? It looked hunched older, as if carrying every slight on its back. His jaw tightened. He whispered the words again, almost testing their sting. "You're no father without money." The echo broke him in places he didn't know were fragile. He reached for the wineglass and found his hand trembling. It rattled softly against the plate, the sound slicing through the silence. He gripped it harder, as if to steady his own pulse. And in that moment, he realized his grief had turned into something heavier, something unyielding. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, whistling through the eaves. It felt like voices of judgment, reminding him of every holiday, every dinner, every sacrifice he had carried alone. He pressed his palm flat against the table, the veins rising like roots grounding him. In his mind's eye, he saw her face again. Not the child he had lifted onto his shoulders in the park, but the woman with eyes cold as glass, lips curling around the words that branded him useless. The contrast pierced him. His breath grew shallow. He whispered to the empty room, "I am her father with or without money." The words startled him, firm, sharp, more defiance than lament. It was the first crack of resolve breaking through the fog. His heart thudded hard in his chest, not from pain, but from something that sounded dangerously close to anger, finally demanding its voice. The silence answered him. The flicker of the candle steadied, and in that stillness, Max knew this dinner would mark the beginning of a storm no one in the family could ignore. Morning crept into the house with a pale light falling across the table still littered with untouched dishes. Max hadn't cleared them. He had sat there for hours, listening to the clock tick and the pipes groan, each sound marking the emptiness of a night spent alone with words that cut deeper than any blade. He rose stiffly, carrying the ache in his shoulders like a burden too long borne. He walked to the small cabinet by the living room wall, the one no one else ever opened. Inside lay envelopes folded, creased, bound by a rubber band that had long since lost its stretch. Debt notes, all signed in his name. Some for her education, others for her failed ventures, many for the comfort she had claimed she needed. Each page told the story of a father's silent surrender. Max placed them on the table, spreading them like cards in a game already lost. His fingers traced the ink of his own signature, the loops and strokes that once meant hope, now branding him as nothing but her lender in her eyes. The silence of the room felt heavier, as if those papers carried not only numbers, but years stolen from his back, his bones, his very breath. He pressed his hands against the edges until they cut faint red lines into his skin. "Is this all I am?" he murmured, voice cracking. The question floated unanswered above the debts and the years. A gust rattled the window, and for a moment he imagined the papers scattering into the fire, curling into ash, lifting into smoke that could never be reclaimed. The vision lodged in him a seed of both fury and liberation. His chest tightened. He stepped back, staring at the pile, his heart hammering as though he stood before a reckoning altar. The debts reflected his sacrifices, yet also her contempt. He felt the weight of every sleepless night, every extra hour at the factory, every prayer whispered in the dark when bills piled too high. Then, as if struck by lightning, the echo of her words thundered again, "You're no father without money." His hand clenched until his knuckles whitened, veins rising like cords. He almost shouted into the empty house, "I was your father before a dollar ever passed between us." The sound rang off the walls, defiant and raw. His breath came fast, uneven. His eyes burned, not just with grief, but with the beginnings of a fire that sought more than answers. It sought a reckoning. The morning stretched on heavy as lead, but Max did not move from the table. The pile of notes glared back at him like silent judges, their inked numbers whispering of every compromise, every sacrifice erased by a single cruel sentence. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could hear his wife's voice again, gentle, steady, reminding him that fatherhood was never about what you could provide, but what you could endure. That memory, fragile yet piercing, made his chest ache. He stood and walked to the fireplace. The logs from last night still smoldered faintly, a soft gray dust clinging to their edges. The air carried a sharp scent of old smoke. He hovered there, the stack of debts trembling in his grip. He could feel the paper pressing into his skin, the corners biting against his palm, the faint crinkle of weightless power. His breath caught as the fire's faint warmth touched his face. I looked down at the papers in my hand. Every page was a chapter of my surrender, each loan, each signature, a vow that my daughter would never go without. And yet in her eyes, I was still nothing. A man reduced to an ATM, my love calculated in figures, not in years of sacrifice. My fingers tightened. A part of me longed to let them fall into the flames, to watch the ink curl the signatures, dissolve the burden, turn to ash. But another part held me still, whispering of timing, of patience, of a reckoning that must be witnessed. The clock chimed, startling in the silence. Its echo spread through the room like a signal marking the line between thought and action. I pressed the papers to my chest, heart pounding against them as if I could brand them with my pulse. The air in the room thickened. I felt the weight of her words circling, stabbing again, echoing louder than the clock, "You're no father without money." The phrase became a drumbeat, each repetition striking harder, breaking, echoing, breaking again. And in that rhythm I found something new, not despair, but defiance. The fire waiting in the hearth was no longer just warmth. It was judgment. It was release. It was truth waiting to be declared. I turned from the flames, papers still in hand. They would not burn yet. Not alone. They would burn when the whole family was there to see, when silence could no longer be their refuge, when every eye would witness what a father's love was worth. And in that thought a strange calm settled over me, like the hush before a storm that would not pass quietly. The afternoon light cut through the blinds in sharp stripes, painting the living room with uneven shadows. Max sat in the armchair, the pile of debt notes still clutched like a lifeline against his chest. He hadn't moved since turning away from the fire. The decision he had made, not yet not alone, kept circling in his head, anchoring him to the present while summoning the storm ahead. He reached for the phone. His hand trembled not from weakness, but from the weight of what he was about to set in motion. His daughter's voice, cold and dismissive, still echoed, "You're no father without money." It was not just a sentence. It was a sentence passed down like a verdict. His jaw tightened as he scrolled his thumb, hesitating over her name before pressing the call. "Dinner. Tonight." Everyone, he said when she answered his tone, leaving no room for protest. Her pause was long tinged with irritation, but she finally agreed. He ended the call before she could twist it into another dagger. The hours that followed were restless. He moved through the house like a man preparing an altar rather than a meal. The plates he set on the table were mismatched, some chipped at the edges, yet each carried a history. The silverware clinked softly, and the sound echoed in the silence of the home, a fragile rhythm that steadied his breath. He placed a candle in the center, its wax already scarred from years of use, and struck a match. The flame leapt alive and steady, and the scent of sulfur lingered before fading into warmth. As evening fell, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached him. Voices followed his daughter's sharper tone, his son-in-law's dismissive laugh, the lighter patter of his granddaughter's feet. Max's heart twisted at that last sound. Innocence was still alive in the house, untainted. The door opened and they walked in. His daughter's eyes scanned the table with thinly veiled disdain, her lips already tightening. "Dad, really, this is what you called us for?" she muttered. The son-in-law smirked, tossing his coat over a chair with careless ease. But the granddaughter ran forward, her small hands reaching for him, her eyes lighting up. "Grandpa," she said, her voice a melody that broke the heaviness for a fleeting second. He knelt, clutching her, inhaling the scent of her hair soap and the faint sweetness of crayons. His eyes stung, though he held back the tears. I stood papers, hidden under my jacket, feeling the heat of them against my ribs. I looked around the room, the chipped plates, the candle flame, their judging faces, and I knew the stage was set. Every sound sharpened the scrape of chairs on the floor, the impatient tapping of his daughter's fingers, the faint creak of the old house as if it too held its breath. The storm was no longer far away. It was here, gathering, pressing against the walls, waiting for the strike. And I would be the one to break the silence. The candle flickered its glow, stretching long shadows across the faces seated at the table. Max stood at the head, his silver hair catching the light like threads of steel, his dark jacket pressed but worn at the edges. His daughter leaned back, arms crossed, her expression, half boredom, half irritation. The son-in-law poured himself water with a clink that sounded louder than it should. The granddaughter sat still, her small eyes darting from one adult to the next, sensing a storm she couldn't name. The air was heavy, thicker than any meal could fill. Max cleared his throat, the sound echoing like the crack of a gavel. "I asked you here tonight," he said slowly, "not for a feast, not for celebration, but for truth." His words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. His daughter rolled her eyes. "Dad, if this is about money again," she began, but he lifted his hand, palm trembling yet firm. The room froze. From inside his jacket he pulled the stack of debt notes, edges frayed from years of being folded and hidden. He set them on the table, the slap of paper against wood, jolting even the son-in-law's smirk. The granddaughter's eyes widened at the sight of the bundle, so many pages bound by a rubber band that had started to crack. "These," Max said, his voice low, "are the chains I carried. For this family. For you. Every late night, every call from creditors, every hour I bent my back in the cold." His hand lingered on the papers, knuckles whitening. His daughter's lips tightened. "So what, that was your job? Parents take care of children. That's life." The words landed like stones. Max inhaled sharply, the old pain in his chest rising, but he held his gaze steady. He looked at her then. at the granddaughter, letting silence stretch until the weight of it pressed against every corner of the room. "I am not your wallet," he said, each syllable deliberate. "I am not the cash register you bang when you're short. I am your father." The flame quivered, casting a sudden gleam across the notes. For a moment, Max imagined tossing them into that small fire right then, watching the debts burn as the candle sputtered. But he steadied himself. Not yet, not here. Instead, he pushed the bundle forward, the papers sliding toward the middle of the table. His daughter flinched back, as if the weight of sacrifice, now visible and undeniable, might stain her manicured hands. I leaned forward, eyes locking with hers, and in that moment my voice broke into something sharper, something unshakable. "Tell me now, if this is what a father's worth to you, if years of sweat equal nothing, what will you do when the fire takes it all?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the hiss of the candle, the pounding of blood in his ears, the shifting of guilt across her face. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. The bundle of debt notes sat between us, silent yet screaming. My daughter's gaze hardened, her fingers tapping the polished table as though she could drum away the weight of my words. The son-in-law leaned forward, his grin returning sly and sharp. "If you're trying to guilt us, it won't work. Paper doesn't make you a father. Money does." The words struck like a lash. My hand hovered above the pile, veins raised under the skin, my pulse beating against the edges of old sacrifice. I could almost feel each page, each line of ink pressed into my flesh like scars carved long ago. I looked at my granddaughter, her wide eyes reflecting the candle's flame. She whispered, barely audible, "Grandpa, why are they so angry?" Her innocence sliced through the air, a fragile bell in a storm of iron. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her the truth, that love should never be measured in receipts, but the son-in-law's voice thundered again. "You're clinging to scraps, old man. Burn them if you want it. Won't change the fact you've got nothing left to give." The challenge hung there, daring me. Echoes of every sleepless night replayed in my mind, the second jobs, the skipped meals, the cold mornings hauling crates, while frost cracked under my boots. Break. My knuckles pressed into the table, wood biting back as if to keep me from shattering. The candle guttered, a sudden hiss rising as wax dripped onto the plate beneath. The air smelled faintly of smoke, as if the fire already knew its hunger. My breath slowed, heavy and measured. "I carried these debts so you could have comfort," I said, my voice deep, shaking yet steady. I bent until my back nearly broke. "And you," my eyes cut to my daughter, the betrayal sharper than any blade. "You tell me I am no father without money." She looked away, shame flickering across her features, but pride stitched her mouth shut. I stood the chair, groaning against the floor, every eye on me now. I picked up the stack, the weight burning against my palm. Slowly, I moved toward the fireplace at the edge of the room, its embers still faint from earlier warmth. Each step echoed deliberate, like the march of a verdict approaching. The granddaughter gasped. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" I stopped before the hearth, turning the papers in my hands, feeling their edges cut lightly into my skin. The glow of the embers painted the pages gold, a cruel illusion of treasure. I raised the stack, slightly holding it in the air. My voice dropped almost a whisper, but each word struck like a hammer. "If these are the measure of a father, then let the fire decide what they're worth." The room held its breath, shadows trembling across the walls. The ash was waiting. The weight of the papers cut into my hand as though they wanted me to bleed for them one last time. The room was a battlefield of silence, broken only by the faint hiss of the embers shifting, breathing beneath the iron grate. My daughter's arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line, but I saw the tremor in her jaw. The son-in-law leaned back, smug, certain I would falter. I lowered the papers toward the fire. The crackle rose, sparks leaping like eager teeth. Heat brushed my knuckles dry and merciless. I thought of the years these notes had ruled me, every dollar earned with sweat that stung my eyes, every meal skipped so theirs could be full. Echo. My wife's face flickered in my memory, soft, patient, urging me on during those long nights. Break. The betrayal of my own blood now pierced that memory like glass shattering. I turned my head slightly. The granddaughter clutched her doll to her chest, her eyes wide and glistening. She whispered again, barely louder than the hum of the fire. "Don't let them take you, Grandpa." Her voice broke me open, but it also steeled me. The son-in-law laughed sharp and ugly. "Do it, old man. Burn them. It won't bring back your pride." I raised my voice louder than I intended, a raw cut in the air. "My pride was never in these papers. My pride was in the roof over your head, the meals on your plates, the nights I froze, so you could be warm." My hand shook, but not from weakness, from fury that had waited too long to speak. The first page slipped from my grip, landing on the embers. Flame licked at the edge, curling it into black smoke, rising in a twisting ribbon. The smell of ink and ash filled the air, bitter and sharp. My daughter gasped, stepping forward, but stopped herself, pride still chaining her. I dropped another sheet, then another. The fire caught faster now, glowing brighter, dancing higher, devouring the years of my labor. Each note shrank, curled, and vanished, the words dissolving into smoke that climbed the chimney like a release of ghosts. The room was no longer silent. The granddaughter cried softly, her tears shining in the firelight. My daughter's lips trembled. The son-in-law cursed under his breath, and my chest rose heavy, as though for the first time in years I could truly breathe. I looked at them, voice steady now, like the rumble of the fire itself. "This is the price of treating a father as an TM. Tonight the debt ends, not mine, but yours." The flames roared bright and consuming, as if they too had waited years for this moment. The fire had taken its first breath, and with it so had I. The fire had grown bold flames, clawing higher, swallowing the stack of notes as if they were nothing but dry leaves. The air thickened with smoke, bitter ink fumes mixing with the scent of old paper turning to dust. Shadows quivered against the walls, alive with the dance of the fire. I felt their heat pressing against my chest like the weight of years finally lifted into the open. Behind me, the granddaughter's sobs broke the rhythm of the crackling fire. She pressed her little face into her doll's fabric hair, muffling her fear. But her words still reached me. "Grandpa, don't hurt yourself." Her innocence cut through the venom that filled the room, a melody against the harsh clang of betrayal. My daughter's eyes glistened. She tried to look away, but the light from the fireplace forced her to confront what burned. Her voice cracked. "Dad, stop. This isn't the answer." Yet even as she spoke, her gaze betrayed her, half desperate to salvage the papers, half unwilling to admit she wanted them for her own gain. The son-in-law scoffed, leaning forward with a smirk that had sharpened into cruelty. "Go ahead, old man. Burn it all. Let's see what you've got left when the last scrap turns to ash." His laugh echoed hollow and brittle, but it sliced the air. Echo. His words bounced against the walls of my mind, colliding with my daughter's earlier blade. "You're no father without money. Break." My chest tightened, but then the sound of the fire shattered those chains. I straightened my back, staring directly into his eyes. "I am not defined by paper," I said, my voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "Not by numbers written in ink, not by what you think I owe. I raise children, not creditors. And if you cannot see that, then it's not me who is lost tonight." I dropped the last of the notes into the fire. They fell like a curtain, closing the final act of a play that had dragged on too long. Sparks shot up glowing embers, leaping before fading into nothing. The debt, the weight, the years, they collapsed into ash. Silence followed, broken only by the hungry crackle of the fire. I looked at my granddaughter. Her tears had slowed, her small hands gripping the doll tighter, as if she understood more than the adults around her. Then I turned back to my daughter, my voice no longer trembling but steady like the last strike of a bell at midnight. "You once told me I wasn't a father without money. Tonight I've proven the opposite. I'm a father who will not be chained by greed, even if it comes from his own blood." The fire glowed brighter for a moment, casting long shadows that seemed to bow toward me. And in that glow I stood tall, not a debtor, not a wallet, but a man reclaiming his name. The fire had settled into a steady glow, no longer wild, but deep, its heat spreading across the room like a silent verdict. The debts were gone, reduced to gray flakes that rose, then disappeared into the chimney's dark throat. The silence it left behind was louder than shouting. It pressed into the walls, into the floor, into the beating of my own heart. My daughter shifted in her seat, the bravado that once carried her words slipping from her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She stared at the hearth, her lips trembling, but no sound came. Her husband still sat smug, but even his smirk faltered under the weight of the moment. He cleared his throat as if to break the spell, but the crack of a burning log silenced him. I felt the echo of her words still lodged in my chest. Dad, you're no father without money. They rang against the fire's hiss, trying to root themselves again. Break. I clenched my hands, my nails digging into my palms until I felt the sting of blood. The sting was real, reminding me I was still standing still, breathing still more than their measure of me. I turned slowly, my eyes sweeping across the room. The kitchen light flickered once, as though it too struggled to keep its glow. The table where I'd once set meals for them now looked barren, the plates untouched. It wasn't hunger that kept them still. It was shame, though they fought to hide it. My granddaughter's small voice broke through. Grandpa, if there's no papers left, does that mean you're free? Her eyes were wide, reflecting the firelight innocence wrapped in curiosity. I knelt beside her, my joints stiff but my hands steady as I placed them on her shoulders. Yes, I whispered, free from the chains of things that were never meant to define us. My voice carried louder as I stood again. A family is not bound by money nor by ink on a page. It is bound by love's sacrifice and the truth we carry in our hearts. My daughter flinched at those words, her face pale in the glow. For a moment her eyes met mine eyes that once long ago carried warmth for me. Now they held confusion, as though she was only beginning to see what she had lost. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the one thing I had not burned, a small folded note my wife had once written years before she passed. Its paper was yellowed, fragile, but her handwriting still bloomed across it, steady and kind. I held it above the firelight, its edges glowing gold. This, I said, my voice tightening, is the only debt I will keep. A promise to her that I would raise this family with love, not with a ledger. And that promise will burn inside me until my last breath. The room fell into silence again. But it was not the silence of shame, it was the silence of truth, landing heavy, undeniable. The ashes in the fire shifted a final crack, sending sparks upward like stars vanishing into night. I stood tall in the glow, the folded note pressed to my chest, my heart beating against it unbroken. The folded note pressed against my chest throbbed with memory. I could almost feel her voice in it, the ink carrying warmth across years. I hadn't read it aloud in decades, maybe because it was mine alone, or maybe because I was afraid of breaking if I did. But as I stood there with their eyes locked on me, I knew silence would no longer serve. I unfolded it slowly, the brittle paper trembling in my hands. The firelight flickered across the words, casting shadows that seemed to dance with her handwriting. My throat tightened, but I began, Max, remember, love is not proven by what you give, but by how you endure. Our children may forget, but the walls of this home will always know your sacrifice. The words cracked through the room like a hammer against glass. My daughter lowered her gaze, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Echo. The same woman who once said, Dad, you're no father without money, now faced the ghost of her mother, saying the opposite. Break. I looked at her directly. Your mother's words, I said, not mine. They remind me that being a father has never been about how many bills I carried in my pocket. It was about carrying all of you through sickness, through hunger, through nights when even hope seemed too expensive. Her husband shifted uncomfortably as if the chair beneath him had grown sharp edges. He opened his mouth to deflect, but the sound of a glass cracking under my tightening grip silenced him. A thin line of red ran across my palm where the shard cut me, but I didn't flinch. Pain was nothing compared to this truth. My granddaughter leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the note. Grandma wrote that, she whispered. I nodded. She wrote it when we had nothing, when we had to choose between paying rent or buying your mother new shoes for school. And she told me then, our children may forget, but love remembers. The fire hissed, one last ember popping and sending a tiny spark onto the hearth. It glowed for a moment, then died, leaving behind only smoke that curled upward like a prayer. I folded the note again, tucking it back into my pocket, not to hide it, but to keep it alive for the right hands, the right eyes someday. I straightened bloodied hand resting on the mantel. So let it be clear tonight, I said, my voice cutting clean. I will not measure myself by money. I will not allow you to measure me by it either. A father's worth is not for sale. The words did not shout. They settled heavy like iron laid on the heart. And for the first time I saw my daughter's eyes well with something other than demand. It was not yet apology, but it was the first crack in her wall. The room had quieted, but quiet does not mean peace. It meant tension had settled in heavy as wet stone. My blood still trickled from the small cut, drying against the ridges of my hand, and the folded note in my pocket burned like a coal. I turned away from the mantel and reached for the drawer beneath the old cabinet. The hinges groaned as though reluctant to give up what was inside. From it, I pulled a thick ledger edges, worn pages, yellowed and heavy with years. My daughter's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" she asked, her voice a mixture of suspicion and unease. I didn't answer at first. I set the ledger on the table, the thump echoing in the room like a gavel. Slowly, I flipped it open. Line after line of neat handwriting filled the pages, dates, numbers, names. The ink faded in places, but every entry was still legible. I dragged my finger down the columns. Mortgage paid when you lost your job. Hospital bill when the baby was born. Tuition when you swore you'd pay me back. Car loan when your husband said he'd cover it. Her face paled. Each line was a mirror she did not want to see. I felt my voice tremble, but it grew firmer with each word. Every debt you ever carried, I carried too. And not once did I call you less of a daughter for needing help. Not once did I measure you in dollars. So tell me what made you believe you could measure me that way. The ledger trembled beneath my palm, not from weakness, but from the weight of what it had held all these years. My granddaughter stood inching closer, eyes wide as if staring at relics from another world. She reached out, brushing the edge of a page. "Grandpa, you wrote down everything." "Yes," I said softly, "because I wanted to remember not your debt, but my love. Sacrifice has a cost, but love keeps the receipt." Her father shifted in his chair, clearing his throat, but the sound was brittle. He muttered, "This doesn't change anything." I snapped the ledger, shut the sound sharp final. "It changes everything I said, because now the truth sits here in ink and paper. The only thing that doesn't change is this: a father's worth is not in the balance of accounts. It is in the weight of his devotion." The fire crackled again, spitting sparks against the iron grate. Shadows leapt across their faces. My daughter's lips parted, but no words came. The silence was no longer heavy stone. It was breaking glass, sharp and unavoidable. And I stood in the middle of it, the ledger under my hand, daring them all to deny what it revealed. The ledger still lay on the table, its cover darkened by age, its pages heavy with memory. My daughter stared at it as though it might bite her, but her husband leaned forward, lips curling into a smirk. "All this proves," he said, "is that you kept tabs like a banker. Maybe you just wanted leverage all along." My chest tightened. I looked at him, then at her. Their silence, their avoidance of the truth, was more painful than their words. I closed my eyes, drawing in the smell of ash from the hearth. When I opened them, I saw not their faces but hers, my late wife, her picture framed above the mantel, watching. She would not have wanted me to keep this book forever chained to numbers that only twisted love into transactions. I stood lifting the ledger in both hands. Its weight pressed down on me like a verdict. "If this book makes me a banker in your eyes," I said, my voice steady, "then it has no place in this house." Gasps broke out as I strode to the fireplace. My granddaughter reached toward me, panic in her voice. "Grandpa, wait." But I shook my head gently. "You already know the truth, child." "That's enough." I opened the ledger to its first page, the ink faded but still clear. With a final breath, I let it slip from my fingers. The flames devoured it, greedily crackling louder, curling each page into black ash. The fire spat sparks upward as though applauding the release. I turned back to them, my hand trembling, but my voice rising like thunder. "There. No more debts. No more receipts. No more excuses to say I was only worth the money I gave. If you want a father, look at me. If you want an ATM, look elsewhere." The room shuddered with silence, broken only by the crack and snap of paper turning to embers. My daughter's eyes welled, but her husband clenched his jaw, muttering curses under his breath. My granddaughter, though, walked to the fireplace, knelt and lifted her small hands toward the rising heat. She whispered, "It's beautiful." And in that fragile moment, as the fire consumed every record of sacrifice, I felt the weight lift. The burden was no longer mine to carry. It was theirs to face what remained when the ledger turned to ash. The fire hissed as the last corner of the ledger folded into itself, leaving only glowing fragments that danced upward before crumbling into nothing. The smoke curled toward the ceiling, gray threads, weaving into the silence that followed. My daughter's face was bathed in the flicker of the flames, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Her husband was less restrained. He slapped the table with his palm, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "You fool," he spat. "All that proof, all that money you claim to have spent, gone. What's left now?" Your pride the insult cut, but I didn't flinch. I stepped closer to the fire, the warmth searing against my skin, my reflection fractured in the glass frame above the mantel. My wife's photograph seemed to glow in the firelight, her eyes steady, as if asking me to hold my ground. I turned, sweeping the room with my gaze. Pride, my voice grew louder. "No. What's left is freedom. For me and for anyone who dares to see me beyond the numbers on those pages." My daughter's eyes widened. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "But Dad, how will anyone know, how will anyone believe you gave so much?" I raised my trembling hand palm open, ashes smeared across my skin. "They'll know by the empty seat at every table I paid for. They'll know by the roof I kept over your heads when the banks came knocking. They'll know because I'm still here even after being told I was no father without money." Her tears fell, but still she did not move toward me. Instead, it was the youngest the child who rose from her chair. She walked slowly, her small shoes clicking on the hardwood, then placed her hand over mine, not afraid of the soot. "I believe you, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice steady in a way that silenced even the grown-ups. A murmur ran through the relatives at the edges of the room. Some shifted uneasily, others lowered their eyes. The balance had shifted. The fire had stripped bare the comfort of denial. I looked down at the little hand over mine, then back at the room filled with those who had measured me in dollars. If a child can see what you refuse to, then maybe it's not me who has lost something tonight. The flames cracked behind me, casting long shadows across their faces. And for the first time in years, I stood taller, not because of what I had, but because of what I had finally let go. The room did not return to its old rhythm after the child's voice. Instead, it thickened as if the air itself held its breath. The fire burned lower embers, glowing red like veins of iron, their steady pulse filling the silence no one dared to break. My daughter's husband leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, but his words faltered before they could leave his lips. For the first time he looked smaller, his anger powerless against the quiet truth standing in the room. I turned toward my daughter, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. Her fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve, knuckles white. That single gesture told me more than words could. Shame had begun its slow creep into her heart. I took a step closer, each movement deliberate, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. "You thought money defined me?" I said, voice low but unshaken. "You thought my worth ended when the bills did. But tonight I've shown you something money can't buy: freedom from your debts, freedom from your hold on me." She whispered, almost too soft to hear Dad. I didn't mean I cut her off, but not with cruelty, with a clarity sharpened by years of sacrifice. "You did mean it." And it broke me. But look around. I gestured to the faces. Some guilty, some restless, and finally to the little girl whose hand still lingered on mine. Not everyone here sees me as an empty wallet. She doesn't. And she is the future, not you. The child's eyes lit with a fragile courage, and she repeated it louder this time, so the whole house could hear. "I believe you, Grandpa." The echo rippled through the room, breaking the silence like a stone dropped in still water. Some relatives nodded faintly, as if granting approval they had withheld for years. Others glanced away, unwilling to face their reflection in the firelight. I drew in a deep breath, the smoke heavy in my lungs, and let the words fall like an oath. From this night on, I will no longer measure myself by what I give away, but by what I refuse to let be taken. The fire popped a sudden burst of spark, and in its glow, their faces were laid bare envy, guilt, awe, and shame, each painted in its own stark color. The weight of silence had shifted. It no longer pressed on me. It pressed on them. The fire had dwindled to a low hum, its glow licking at the edges of paper that once shackled me. Around the table, no one lifted a fork. Plates of untouched food steamed and cooled, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon pie turning bitter against the tension that hung in the air. I stood tall, feeling the weight that had crushed me for years now, burned away in those flames. My daughter finally raised her head, her eyes glassy, searching for some foothold in a world that no longer bent to her demands. "You burned everything," she said, her voice trembling. "Every note, every promise. Do you realize what you've done?" "I do," I answered, steady. "I've broken chains. Not for you because you forged them, but for me because I carried them." A murmur rippled through the family. My brother-in-law muttered, "He's lost his mind," yet his voice lacked conviction, as though even he felt the shift none of them wanted to name. Then I turned to the child, my granddaughter still clutching her napkin with small fists as if holding on to courage. I knelt so my tired eyes met her unbroken ones. "Do you know what money is worth?" I asked softly. She shook her head. "It's worth nothing if it costs love. And love is worth everything, even if it comes with empty pockets." Her tiny voice rang out clear, sharper than any adult's defense. "I don't want money, Grandpa. I just want you." The words echoed, breaking the last fragile wall of denial. My daughter covered her face with her hands. A chair scraped back, someone rose, another sat, and the room swayed with a current too strong to resist. I stood again, placed my calloused hand on the mantel where the ashes still smoldered, and declared, "This fire isn't just the end of debt. It is the end of your power over me. You cannot measure me by what I own or what I pay. Tonight, the only inheritance I claim is dignity." The flames crackled in agreement, scattering sparks like stars. And for the first time, I felt the silence wasn't heavy, it was listening. The smell of smoke lingered long after the last ember sank into black. I kept my hand on the mantel, steadying myself, though my heart beat with a strange calm. Across the table, faces shifted, some pale with shame, others tight with resentment. The old clock on the wall ticked louder than words, its rhythm cutting through the silence. My daughter finally lowered her hands. Her mascara streaked her cheeks, but her eyes held something harder than sorrow, defiance. "You think this makes you noble?" she spat. "All you've done is ruin what little chance we had to survive." I took a step forward, and every creak of the wooden floor sounded like a gavel. "Survive?" I echoed, my voice sharper than the crackle of the fire. "You chained me with debts that were never mine. You hollowed out every holiday, every meal, until love became an invoice. That wasn't survival, it was slow death." Her husband rose, his chair screeching back. "We depended on you." What kind of father abandons his own blood? The words sliced, but I did not flinch. I turned, letting my eyes sweep the room, each set of eyes avoiding mine, except the small, brave pair of my granddaughters. I placed my hand on my chest and let the silence stretch until it felt unbearable. Then I said with a voice that broke, but did not bend, "A father does not abandon his children. A father teaches them. And tonight I am teaching you that love cannot be bought, borrowed, or traded. If you cannot see that, then perhaps you have abandoned me." The air cracked like ice. For a moment, no one moved. Then the granddaughter slipped from her chair, came to my side, and held my hand as though sealing my words in flesh and blood. That was when I saw it, the ripple of realization spreading through the room. One cousin pushed his plate away. An uncle shifted uncomfortably. Even the brother-in-law, who mocked me, stared at the floor. My daughter shook her head, but her lips trembled, her armor buckling under the weight of a truth she could no longer deny. The house was no longer mine alone. It had become a court, and in that court, the fire had already delivered its verdict. The room pulsed with the weight of words, unspoken. The fire in the hearth had died down, but its smoke clung to the air, curling like judgment over every bowed head. My daughter's voice broke the silence, jagged and trembling. "You think one act erases years of responsibility. You think fire makes you free," her defiance echoed, but I saw the cracks in it. I straightened my shoulders, the light from the dying embers glinting across my silver hair. "No. I said slowly, my voice steady as a drumbeat. The fire doesn't free me. It exposes you. Her breath caught, and for the first time, her eyes darted away. My gaze swept across the room, landing on each face. Some were hardened, others softened by shame. My son-in-law shifted uneasily, muttering, "Maybe he's right," but his words trailed off, swallowed by the tension. I turned, pointing to the blackened ashes. "There lies your ledger. Every page of my labor twisted into your chains. Do you feel its absence, or does the emptiness frighten you more than the debt ever did?" Silence thickened. Then, like a soft crack in stone, my granddaughter's voice rose. "Grandpa," she whispered, "you don't need money to be a father. You're already mine." Her tiny hand squeezed mine, anchoring me in the storm. The words rippled outward. An aunt covered her mouth, tears slipping past her fingers. A cousin shifted his chair, to scrape against the floor, cutting the silence like thunder. My daughter, shaken, shook her head violently, her pride collapsing like wet paper. I stepped into the center of the room, no longer the man they mocked, but the pillar they could not move. "I was never your wallet," I declared, my voice rising, filling every corner. "I was your father. I bled in the fields, I bent my back so you could stand tall. And if you choose to see only what I cannot give, then you were never my children, you were creditors in my own home." The words slammed against the walls like hammer blows. My daughter staggered back, her face pale, lips trembling. No one came to her defense this time. All eyes were fixed on me, the man they thought broken. The man who had set fire not just to paper, but to illusion. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, thick with recognition, heavy with truth. The house itself seemed to breathe with me. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the weight of their scorn. The verdict was clear, and it was not mine to bear. The echo of my words still quivered in the rafters, as if the house itself had taken sides. My daughter stood rigid, her chest heaving, but her power drained like sand slipping through clenched fists. The faces around her no longer reflected her contempt. They reflected the shame she refused to carry. I could hear the tick of the old clock on the wall, its pendulum slicing the silence into merciless beats. Each swing was an accusation, each tick a reminder. Time reveals what pride hides. She finally broke. You don't understand what it's like to keep up, to be respected? Without money, people laugh at us." Her voice cracked, desperation clawing at the edges. I stepped closer, slow and deliberate. "No, child. They don't laugh at us. They laugh at you because you confuse love with status." My hand pointed toward the charred remains in the hearth smoke, still whispering up like a sermon. "That fire didn't just burn debt. It burned the throne you built from my labor. And now you sit on ashes." Her knees buckled. For a moment she looked like a child again, stripped of armor, the same girl I once lifted onto my shoulders to watch the fireworks. My chest ached, but I did not move to comfort her. Around us the atmosphere shifted, and Uncle murmured, "He's right." A cousin whispered, "We forgot." The air buzzed with the sound of reconciliation fighting shame. My granddaughter clung tighter to my hand, her small voice piercing through the storm. "Grandpa's never been poor to me. He's rich in the ways that matter." Her words detonated in the room. Heads bowed, eyes wet. The young men who once chuckled at my worn jacket now stared at the floor, their pride fractured. The house had turned, the current reversed. I drew a breath that carried decades of sacrifice and betrayal, and released it like a verdict. I will not beg for your recognition. You know who I am. If you cannot see it, then you are the blind, not I. The room held its breath. My daughter buried her face in her hands, her sobs the first honest sound she'd made in years. The throne of pride she sat on had crumbled, and before her stood not an old man broken by money, but a father unshaken by its absence. The silence after was no longer hostile, it was reverent. They knew the crown of that house had shifted, and it rested not on wealth, but on truth. The smoke had thinned, but the smell of scorched paper lingered, clinging to the walls like memory itself. It curled around the chandeliers, seeping into the old wood, reminding every breath in the room that nothing written on those notes held sway over me anymore. I stood straighter than I had in years. My daughter's shoulders slumped, trembled beneath the weight of her own words. She had carved me into an ATM, and now the machine was gone, replaced by the man she once forgot existed. Her voice broke through the hush, brittle as glass. Dad, if you don't pay, we lose everything. The house, the reputation, our name. I stepped forward, my shadow stretching across the carpet toward her. Our name, I said, my tone deep as the ticking clock was never written in ledgers. It was carved into sweat sacrifice, and nights I went without so you could have more. I gestured toward the fireplace where the last ember winked like an eye refusing to close. That flame holds more honor than all your possessions combined. Gasps stirred. My brother's widow muttered, "He's right." Another relative whispered, "We've all leaned too hard on his back." The words rippled, breaking the tide that had long drowned me. I caught my daughter's eyes, red, swollen, searching. For a heartbeat, her gaze darted between the crowd and me, torn between shame and surrender. But I did not flinch. From behind my granddaughter's small hands slipped into mine again. "Grandpa," she said softly, but the words carried louder than any plea. "You already gave us more than money. You gave us stories and us." The crowd inhaled as one as though a veil had lifted. I felt it too, the crack in the armor, the echo finally breaking. My daughter sank into the nearest chair, sobbing into her palms. Not defiant now, but undone. I raised my head, sweeping the room with eyes that once lowered in silence. If this family survives, it will not be because of what's in my pocket. It will be because of what's left in our hearts. And in that moment, with the embers still glowing faintly, the crown shifted. No longer built of money, but of fire, truth, and the strength of a father who had finally refused to bow. The weeping of my daughter had quieted into faint hiccups, the sound fragile as a candle sputtering in the draught. Around us, the family sat frozen, each face caught between disbelief and recognition, as though they too had been unmasked by the fire. The ledger smoke had not only blackened the ceiling, it had lifted something heavy from my chest. I walked slowly to the head of the table, the same spot where I had once bowed to demand sliding checks across polished wood like offerings. My hand brushed the edge of the chair, rough with years of use, and I heard it creak in reply. That creak sounded different now, less like submission, more like an oath. "Do you hear it?" I asked, my voice low yet steady. The room leaned closer. "That sound isn't money. It's memory. It's the weight of nights I ate less so you could eat more. It's the echo of every nail I drove, every mile I walked, every hour I worked. That's the currency that built this family." No one dared to interrupt. My daughter's hands slipped from her face. Her eyes met mine, wet and searching. For the first time, I saw no calculation there, only the hollow tremor of a woman realizing the measure of what she'd said. From the far side of the table, my eldest nephew stood abruptly. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound cutting like a blade. He cleared his throat, hesitant, then bowed his head. "Uncle Max," he murmured, "I mocked you once. I said your hands were too old, your ways outdated. But tonight," he paused, swallowing hard. "Tonight you showed us what real wealth looks like." The silence swelled again, but it was no longer suffocating. It was fertile like soil waiting for seeds. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to soften, as if time itself bowed to the moment. I glanced toward the fireplace one last time. The final ember glowed faintly, a stubborn eye refusing to shut. I raised my chin and let my words settle into every corner of the room. "This silence," I said, "is worth more than any applause. Because it means you finally heard me." And in that hushed space, the silence spoke louder than every dollar ever printed. The smoke from the fireplace had thinned, but its sting still lingered in the air, clinging to every breath. I stood there, my shadow stretched long against the wall, my chest heaving with a weight that felt heavier than all those years of labor. For once I didn't need to defend myself further, the fire had already spoken. Yet my eyes scanned the table. Faces that once looked at me with calculation now avoided my gaze ashamed. Plates of turkey and bread sat, untouched, steam long faded. The room had become a courtroom, and silence was the verdict. I leaned both palms on the table, the wood cool beneath my hands. "You wanted money," I said slowly, steady, the words carrying like a hammer striking an anvil. "But money burns, money vanishes. What doesn't vanish is the life I've already given you, the nights. I worked the meals, I skipped the dignity. I swallowed, just to keep this family together. A nephew lifted his head, voice unsteady. Uncle Max, we didn't see it. We only saw what you didn't give us. I nodded once, but my gaze fixed on my daughter. Her lips trembled, her hands clenched in her lap. She had once thrown her words like knives, but now she sat unarmed, a silence cutting her deeper than she had ever cut me. I took the old leather wallet from my pocket, the one I'd carried since her childhood. Its corners were worn stitching, frayed. I placed it on the table with a soft thud. This wallet once held your first photo the day you were born. Later it held every pay stub I brought home, every bill I stretched to cover your dreams. And tonight it holds nothing. Empty. I pushed it across the table toward her. But even empty, it means more than money, because it carries memory, sacrifice, love. Her hand hovered, then drew back. She couldn't take it. The weight was too heavy. The fire popped behind me, sparks leaping for a moment, echoing the words unspoken. I stood tall, straightened my jacket, and looked around the room. From this night forward, you will never mistake me for an ATM again. You will remember that I am a father, a man, and no amount of money will ever buy that truth away. The hush deepened. In that silence, in the shimmer of unshed tears across the table, I felt the tide turn. They hadn't said it aloud, but I saw it in their faces. They finally knew. They finally saw me. The wallet still sat there, untouched, a relic between us. I could hear the faint crackle of the fire behind me, each spark like an echo of the words I had spoken. My daughter's eyes fixed on the table, her fingers twisting in her lap. For once she couldn't summon the sharpness of her tongue. I shifted my weight, the old chair groaning beneath me. You thought I was less of a father without money, I said, my voice lower now, like the embers fading in the hearth. But let me tell you what makes a father. It's not the bills he pays or the debts he clears. It's the nights he stays awake when his child is sick. It's the hours he works so they don't feel hunger. It's the love that never asks for repayment. Her shoulders shook, but she stayed silent. I let the moment stretch, let the quiet press down until it became unbearable. Then I leaned forward, my hand trembling as it brushed the edge of the wallet. I carried you before you could walk. I fought for you before you could fight. And I forgave you even when your words tore me apart. I lifted my eyes to hers, finally catching them unflinching. Tonight, I don't ask for respect. I demand it. Because I am your father. Whether you honor me or not, the truth won't change. The others shifted uneasily. My nephew swallowed hard. My brother-in-law looked down ashamed. No one dared speak. Only the fire gave sound, whispering its approval with every pop of the wood. I rose slowly, my knees stiff, my hands marked with the years of labor that had built this family's foundation. I walked to the mantel where her mother's picture rested, the soft glow of the fire kissing the glass. With reverence, I placed my palm against the frame. This woman, I said, my voice thickening, stood beside me when there was nothing. She never once asked for more than love. And I gave her everything I had. My throat tightened, but I pushed the words out. I will not let her memory be cheapened by greed. I turned then, standing tall, my back straight, my eyes burning. You will leave this house tonight with a new understanding. You will remember the fire, the ashes and the wallet left empty on the table. And you will remember that I am not here to be measured by what I can hand over. I am here because I am your father. The silence thickened, heavier than stone. And in that silence they bowed, not out of command, but because the truth finally broke them. The night closed gently over the house, the fire dwindling to a faint red glow. The sharp words, the accusations, the ash rising in the air, all of it seemed to have drained away, leaving only a stillness that was almost holy. My daughter sat quietly now, her face pale, her eyes uncertain. She had come here asking for money, expecting authority to bend to her will. What she left with was something different, an image she would never forget, her father standing unshaken before the flames. I gathered the room with a glance. My relatives, once quick to judge, had no more clever remarks. Their gazes were heavy with something closer to respect or perhaps shame. I didn't need their words. Their silence was enough. I stepped back toward the mantel where my wife's photograph caught the last flicker of light. For a moment, I let myself smile at her picture, a small nod to the woman who had walked with me through every hardship. She had known who I was long before the world tried to measure me by numbers. I whispered softly, almost to her, "Now they know." Then I turned away, the weight in my chest easing at last. Tomorrow life would continue, maybe the same, maybe changed. But tonight the truth had been carved into memory. A father is not a wallet. A father is a pillar, even when the world leans too hard against him. And to you, my listeners, thank you for walking through this story with me. May it remind you of the unseen sacrifices that build every family and the quiet strength of those who give without asking. I wish you health, peace, and happiness in your homes, and may your loved ones always see you for who you are, not for what you can give. Now they know.